Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program, Cliff Isaacson, who is Executive VP Product Strategy at Blue Ridge Global. And today we're going to talk about price optimization, the next big opportunity in supply chain. Now, companies across virtually all industries are looking for ways to drive profitable growth. And, many of them have implemented CRM, ERP, and other supply chain applications. And after kind of capturing the low hanging fruit opportunities from those systems, they're now asking, what's the next big opportunity to drive business benefits? And for many, the answer is price optimization. But what is price optimization? Why is it important? And what capabilities should companies look for in a solution? Well, those are the key questions we're going to address in today's episode. And it's great to have Cliff on the program to share his insights and advice on this topic. So, Cliff, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. Love talking about pricing and supply chain. So thanks.
Absolutely. Well, this was a topic that certainly, 2 or 3 years ago, I knew relatively little about. And then, we're just in the cusp of completing a market study on this. So I've learned a lot about it. And, that's why I titled this episode, The Next Big Opportunity in Supply Chain, because I definitely see, this being, one of those areas that a lot of companies probably don't know much about, but they're probably going to learn a lot more and need to know a lot more, moving forward. But before we dive into the, what is price optimization, why is this important, and so forth, you're a first-time guest here on Talking Logistics, and like I always like to do whenever I bring on a new guest, I'm always curious how people, get into this industry. So why don't you tell us briefly a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved in this industry, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at Blue Ridge Global?
Definitely. I actually started in logistics, actually in strategy consulting, but left to start to co-found a trucking logistics software company. This was back in '99 with one of the first .com booms, and really wanted to leave the Wall Street consulting environment. And I started talking to somebody, and trucking logistics and bidding and freight was an intriguing topic. And I really wanted to get back to hard hat and steel tip shoes, and there was a good opportunity for it. And after that, we sold the company, and I went to a company that did inventory optimization and replenishment. And we ended up actually selling that to SAP, but a great experience, really understanding supply chain planning for largely for manufacturers and global 1,000 companies. And it was actually after that I helped to acquire a price optimization company for service parts. I was already at a company doing inventory optimization for spare parts, and I just fell in love with pricing. I thought, wow, this is how it fits with supply chain. Pricing for industrial goods is a fascinating topic. I can talk for hours about it. It's something very the nuances and the art and the science of it are fascinating. And it's really hard science because it's really long tail assortments, it's intermittent demand items. It was a great place to start. And after that, I spent 10 plus years in retail and industrial goods pricing at different software vendors, heading up product. And finally, I got the bug again. I founded another software company for industrial goods, specifically small distributor pricing. And I did that. That's actually how I ended up at Blue Ridge in my current position. They acquired the software company, and I joined to head up product strategy and take this blend of supply chain planning, inventory optimization, replenishment, pricing, and bring it together. So I'm here at Blue Ridge, driving the product strategy and how we build out products, and launching and building out and designing this pricing solution that's really targeted towards distribution, light manufacturing, and retail. So
Great. Well, great journey there, and I think it's symbolic of the fact that, particularly when you talk about pricing, it really has, there's the core focus of it, in terms of, pricing analysts and people that are responsible for pricing. But the reality is that it has, it influences and is influenced by many other aspects of supply chain. The fact that you've worked and have experience in these other areas, inventory management, supply chain planning, logistics, and so forth. I mean, you bring some good, perspective there. And again, I also, in this age where we're talking now about, machine learning and artificial intelligence, and the fact that we've got more data at our disposal. And the question is, how do we convert that data into, insights and then into business value? I think, price optimization is one of those areas where there's a lot of data. If you can get to it, you can get to it effectively and then apply some of those technologies to that. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. So before we kind of dive into the kind of that meat, let's start with the basic question. What is price optimization?
It's a great question. And it means many different things in many different industries. To me, in short, it's setting prices based on market conditions and customer willingness to pay. There's a lot of complexity below that. It's, what are supplier constraints? There's price introduction when you introduce new products. There's end of life. But in the end, it's really getting away from what people typically call cost plus, and people wrap it around very complex processes and structures, pricing matrices, a lot of people call it. They use Excel in really complex ways. But if you're just taking cost and then marking it up or adding a margin to it without really determining how to set the price based on what the customers or what the value to the customer is, then it's not really price optimization. So, I call it, setting the right price at the right time for the right product, given the right customer. So, that kind of those tangents driving what the right price is.
Yeah, and you brought up a few things there. Number one, one of the things I've seen in the research is just like every other type of supply chain application, Excel tends to be the dominant application that people have historically used to manage this. And I think we all know, particularly in 2020, when you're operating critical functions with spreadsheets or manual based processes, it's going to be very difficult to succeed, moving forward. I think the optimization piece also comes into the fact that, you really, if all you're leveraging is this cost plus model, that's not really optimization, right? I mean, optimization almost by definition, when you really talk about optimization, is you're leveraging multiple inputs, and then you're leveraging mathematical equations, based on certain constraints and certain questions that you're hoping to answer, so there's a lot of, mathematics that's involved, with it, that I think, is part of what defines it as part of, optimization. And I think for a lot of folks, and this is where I was coming from, and maybe you can comment a little bit here. I think a lot of folks say, okay, yeah, price optimization, I've heard about that. The hotels have done that, airlines have done that,
Right.
And that, right? You go to online to try to get an airline ticket, at least back in the pre-COVID days. And, if you went at 9 a.m. in the morning, you would see one price. And if you went at 12 in the afternoon, you probably saw a different price because they were dynamically changing, these prices. And certainly that's a segment of it, but, it goes beyond that, particularly when you're talking about manufacturers, when you're talking about B2B distributors and so forth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think people are starting to understand you would pay more if something starts selling out. It's, it's availability. And so everybody, that's familiar with supply chain understands inventory availability and how that probably is tied to a price tag. The difference is it's not necessarily that dynamic. Airlines, of course, it's a consumer facing application of pricing. It's dynamic pricing. It's the equivalent of retail pricing. And I've done e-commerce pricing with retail, as well as actually in Europe with electronic shelf labels. It's constantly changing. There was one Norwegian retailer I worked with. They would not guarantee the same price if you spent more than an hour in their store, which is a small store. In Norway, you wouldn't spend more than an hour in there. But it was interesting because I think people are starting to become familiar with that concept. However, it's much longer term. When you're negotiating a contract for a long-term, 2-3 year agreement, you're not going to change prices all the time. But I would argue it's probably more important to get the prices right, because if you're entering that agreement, you better know exactly what that price is. And it comes down to using science to determine what is underpriced versus overpriced. And overpriced, you're going to hear about it, and it's something that impacts customer satisfaction. Customers are going to tell you and going to feel like they're being gouged. but they're not going to tell you about underpriced items. They're not going to tell you where they see a real huge gap in the market and you're charging much lower than other commodities items. And it's easier to do for those fast moving items. People are really good at that. But when you're in manufacturing or distribution, or even a larger retailer with a large assortment, it's that long tail. And I'm a science person. When you're familiar with supply chain planning, that's the hard part to forecast. Turns out it's the hard part to price as well. And that's where, better forecasting techniques, there's also better pricing techniques for that long tail assortment.
Yeah, that's great point there. And I mean, when people talk about pricing too, I mean, people often refer to or look at, the price waterfall, right? And all the different elements that go into, that price. You've got off invoice items that go into it as well, discounts and things like that. So, I mean, it really becomes a much more, particularly in the B2B world, becomes a much more complex, pricing environment than just, the B2C, side of things. But let's talk now, why is it important? I mean, why should companies care about this? And, what's the business case or value proposition?
Yeah, great question. And, it's not a one size fits all. Some companies tend to use pricing for different objectives, but in the end, pricing really drops to the bottom line very quickly. When you change prices, you're going to hear about it and you're going to see a change to your financial position, and hopefully for the better, hopefully, for profits. But it's not always about profits. For some product categories, it's about market share. I understand that. But it's interesting because a lot of studies have been done, and the general consensus is, and it varies by industry, it actually is more influential in distribution and manufacturing requirements. When you improve pricing, when you get better results, it can be 2 to 4 times better profit impact than a cost of goods sold reduction. And I'm not discounting the benefits of inventory optimization and better demand forecasting. That's a huge, there are huge benefits associated with that, pulling working capital out of the balance sheet and improving service levels. But when you improve pricing, you're hitting profits, very quickly. And the other thing you start to look at, I mentioned it, underpriced, overpriced, that can impact pricing consistency and your customer's perception of you. And so it can actually turn out to improve customer satisfaction. And I think the big one, given, I'm biased here, but it's better management of demand. And I can talk more about it, but when you can use pricing to get better control over your demand forecasts, and that can be very powerful.
Yeah, no, I think, like I mentioned, the market study that we're about to publish, we looked at some of those sources out there that have done research, academic and likewise. And, for decades now, they've shown, the powerful lever that, price optimization is in terms of, profitability. And the other thing that you just brought up, which leads me to my next question, is, historically, I mean, I think price optimization has been viewed mainly, at least from my perspective, as a sales support solution, right? So it's something that has been sold to or targeted to the sales organization, has been sold to the pricing analysts within an organization, and obviously that's the core for users of this, if you will. But in many ways, as you've been alluding to, it's really a supply chain solution. So I guess, how does price optimization inform or impact, supply chain processes? And can you give an example?
Definitely. And I think we're seeing a lot of this being accelerated over the last 12 months. But when you change price, people tend to be very familiar and hold tight to the vest monitoring of their A items, their A plus items, these commodity items, these fast moving items that may have a competitive substitute. If you don't, you're worried about having a competitive substitute, and that they're probably price sensitive. So when you change the price of those, you can, especially in A item, you can really change demand. That is inherently price sensitivity. A lot of techniques to get longer, get into the long tail of the assortment and these intermittent demand items, but price can change the demand of them over time. It's just a much longer feedback loop. So it takes time. But in the end, when you drop price, you tend to sell more of things. And with A items, certainly you'll see that immediate demand response. And that should be fed into a demand forecast. And on the flip side, when you're doing replenishment, when you're ordering against a supplier or a commodity provider as a manufacturer, you're hitting supplier brackets, right? There are volume controls, there's filling a truck, there's filling a container. And because of that, you need to pull forward demand and order products to fill up that truck in the simplest use case. And so when you do that, your overage, you have inventory overages on some items. And, inventory optimization is about, getting your best service levels with the lowest inventory level possible. There's the asymptotic curve. The more service level you have, the exponentially larger amounts of inventory. When you have those inventory overages, think of the costs associated with that. The warehouse stocking, the labor constraints, the transportation constraints. Pricing is a great way of then adjusting, bringing down those inventory levels on those items. And that's where you get into the nuances, where when they start to play together, how can you use price to, if something's critically short, you shouldn't be dropping price on it. If you can coordinate those two to work together, then it's not only about reducing inventory overages, it's about, preventing the sales team or preventing the finance team from lowering the price on these, under inventory items. So those can all play well together to really improve pricing in two different core use cases. Really, there is list pricing and net pricing. And let me describe those a little bit. If you're in certain states, you're a wine and spirits distributor, you act more like a retailer. You're selling at a set price that everybody knows about. And, there are techniques there for making sure you get the price right. And you only have the chance as a distributor or manufacturer to change that price every so often. But if you're a sales team that's negotiating prices using discounts and rebates and volume deals for different customers, that's where you really have to control pricing based on who the customer is and what customer segment they belong to, how much volume of business are they giving you, what discounts and rebates are available over time that influence that, that pricing waterfall you mentioned. What is the overall pocket profitability by customer, by product? And so those two forms of pricing really dominate. And, for distributors and manufacturers, they have both typically. And that's where it can add some complexity. It's not a simple retail use case. It's not, I would say retail is a simpler problem to solve, because if it's not a fast moving item, it's probably coming out of the assortment. Right. Not so with distribution.
Right. No, great examples there. And, as you were talking, I mean, I think, and some of the research, kind of confirmed this, is, it's very similar to what we see historically, right? You see companies look at pricing as a siloed, function, So we are just like, we always, as analysts, we always talk about the need to break down functional silos, right? Between, in this case, as we're talking about, inventory management, inventory optimization, demand planning, and pricing, right? Breaking down those functional barriers and bringing, those decisions that are made in a much more, tightly integrated, fashion. It's the same thing on the technology front, right? So we've seen, over time, the technology that companies use to manage these different business functions have also been in siloed form. And I think what we've seen over the years in other areas, we've seen, the coming together of these, capabilities into more integrated platforms. And I think now is the time when we're starting to see now pricing coming into these supply chain platforms, so that, companies are able to take this more integrated, more holistic workflow approach that, better integrates the pricing component to it as part of everything that you just talked about there, the inventory side, the demand side, and so forth. Which is part of the reason why, based on the study that we did, we expect, market awareness and adoption of a price optimization solutions to grow and accelerate in the years ahead. I mean, what do you see from being in the front lines of this? I mean, what do you see as the biggest factors, driving this growth?
Yeah, you bring up some interesting sort of long-term trends. There's been for a long time separate retail price optimization and vendors for that, software vendors and technology. There's B2B pricing vendors and price optimization vendors, more on the negotiated pricing side. And we're starting to see that convergence with supply chain planning. A couple of years ago, you would talk about S&OP technologies and processes very differently from closer in statistical demand forecasting and supply chain planning. Those are really, together now and talked about as a single, coordinated and integrated supply chain planning function. And, the same thing is true. And it's actually gotten accelerated. What we've seen is over the last couple of months, we have great insight into, we have a large proportion of our customers are distributors. We have some retailers, we have some light manufacturers, and we've had the benefit as a cloud-based solution to go in and see trends in wine and spirits, in HVAC and plumbing, in auto parts and other durable goods, in North America, in Europe. And what we've seen is lots of supplier volatility. We just had a customer advisory board where we talked to our largest customers, and they were talking about some of the best practices. How do you manage supplier volatility, supply and inventory availability from suppliers, and these great fluctuations in costs? Like I mentioned, cost plus is a simplistic approach, but margin is important to drive profits. The other thing that has been huge across these categories has been peaks in demand in certain product categories and increases on certain sales channels, in particular e-commerce. If you have an e-commerce sales channel, you've seen a huge bump. And so peaks in product categories, we work with a lot of wine and spirits and food and beverage, big shifts in demand, but overall, big jumps in certain product categories. You think of the closures of on-premise to off-premise consumption, but that really changes which products are selling strongly. Furniture is up. We work with a lot of furniture distributors, and they sell on e-commerce to e-commerce, large e-commerce players, big jump in sales. Auto repair parts. Now that people are looking at deferral of OEM purchases of automotive, of cars and automobiles, or even heavy trucks, they're looking at service parts, and there's been peaks in certain repair part categories. How do you manage that demand? They've gotten a handle on it. We use a lot of machine learning techniques to improve your forecast and respond to this, to do some demand sensing so that you can get a better replenishment and really manage, not over investing in inventory and tying up a lot of working capital. But now customers are looking at pricing and going, wow, it is very clear the relationship on certain channels to customer willingness to pay and a better price. And so I think that move to e-commerce sales, the volatility of costs, is driving recognition of better pricing and the need for that to really control your margins and try to claw back some of the profits that are getting tied up with, we've had some customers, PE-backed customers, that they're going to throw inventory at it to make sure there's availability. You can't make money if it's stocked out. But now they're starting to see, wow, if it's better priced, now you can actually claw back some of these profits.
A lot of great factors there, and I think we certainly saw some of that in the study that we did. And I mean, you can't also, in this COVID environment, certainly I think that's become another catalyst for just about every type of digital transformation that's taking place out there for a lot of companies. Like I mentioned earlier, things are changing very quickly. You've got these, big shifts in demand that are happening. In some cases, huge surges in demand. In other cases, huge declines in demand, depending on the industry and so forth. And as they're looking to how to, navigate through this quote unquote new normal, they're recognizing, a lot of companies are recognizing that, this is one area that, they're leaving opportunities on the table because they don't have, the right technologies in place or, a scalable way to do this, effectively. And certainly in a lot of in a lot of companies don't even have the right organizational structure, to do this, which in some cases is really the kind of the prerequisite. You first have to, have the right talent and the right people and the right approach and the processes in place, and then leverage the technology on top of that. Well, Cliff, we're running a little bit short on time here, so I'm just going to go right to my last question. As a way to wrap up, then what questions should companies ask themselves to assess whether they're a leader or a laggard when it comes to price optimization, and what capabilities are most important?
Yeah, great question. You probably heard it before. Do you use cost plus? And you might use very complex terms around matrices pricing, matrix pricing. But in the end, if it's Excel or Microsoft Excel or even Microsoft Access, but you're just looking at cost plus, you're probably leaving money on the table. And probably is my code word for you are definitely leaving money on the table. And what it really means is you're probably underpriced on some items, which is the low-hanging fruit, right? That's where, looking at the long tail of the assortment, how can you raise prices on some items up to willingness to pay to start getting more profits? But you're probably overpriced on some items. You're probably getting some signals from the market that you're overpriced, where there's a competitive substitute. And I'm not saying you would drop price on those items. That's a different conversation. You have to think long and hard about it, but you don't want to raise prices. If you're doing a general price increase, don't raise prices on something that's overpriced. So that's kind of the fundamental question you should ask. The other question is, hey, I get it. Measuring willingness to pay gets you away, but it still manages margins. What type of pricing are you doing? Is it list pricing? Are you publishing a list price? There are certain things you should do to establish better, insert some science into your setting prices. Maybe it's a general price increase. Maybe it's publishing an annual price list. Maybe it's more frequent than that. Versus if you have, and I would suggest you typically start there. Get a better starting price, because even if you're doing the second type of pricing, this negotiated B2B price, it starts with a better list price, whether anyone ever sees that price or not. And then start looking at your rebates, start looking at your discounts. Are you managing them well? It's something I would ask. Do you discriminate or differentiate prices between customers? And ask yourself, is this customer getting the right price? Are you discounting too much to win their business? Are your sales teams, rogue sales, just doing what they can to close deals? Hey, getting demand and closing deals is important, but putting some science to it to guide them, to enable and give them tools to show, hey, maybe you don't need to discount for this customer. Maybe they're not giving you the same volume of business. Maybe they're less price sensitive. There's things you can do to really enable your sales team. And then finally, as you get to the more sophisticated levels of pricing, how do you tie it with supply chain planning? How do you do better product introductions? How do you look at SKU rationalization and use pricing to do end-of-life pricing and rationalize that SKU assortment? And then finally, how can you actually get to shaping demand? How can you tie it to pulling supply chain planning into your pricing decision making? Locking prices so you don't drop prices on underpriced, on under inventoried items. And then more importantly, how do you start shaping demand? So, that's sort of painting a picture of a maturity curve. And, I would talk to anybody about starting to think about where you are in the maturity curve.
A lot of great questions there, and certainly a great, great starting point. As you mentioned earlier, we could probably talk for, 2-3 hours, about this topic. And it's certainly a topic that for sure we're going to be discussing more, in the weeks and months ahead, because I really truly believe that this is an area that more and more companies are going to be looking at and want to learn more about. But I think you provided some great, insights and advice to get the conversation started today. So Cliff, again, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much, Adrian. I appreciate it.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Blue Ridge website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Cliff, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.